When asked to conjure up a mental image of Jesus, most people imagine a man with long hair, a beard, and a white coat. After all, famous works of art have long depicted Christians in exactly the same way. But that's not how Joan Taylor describes him. Professor of Jesus at King's College London, says these common depictions are factually inaccurate. In fact, she claims to have convincing evidence to support her interpretation of what religious leaders really looked like. Scholars claim to know what Jesus really looked like, and this painting boosts their theory. Interestingly, our modern vision of Jesus comes from artwork created as far back as the 4th century. Artists of the time actually had centuries of pious artwork from which they drew inspiration for more modern religious figures. So it seems they were depicting Jesus with the same floppy locks of hair and long beard that the ancient gods had. The artists also took liberties with the accessories Jesus wore in the paintings. For example, Christ sometimes had a halo over his head or held a Bible in his hand. At other times he sat on a throne, just like a mythical god. But according to Taylor, these and other details could not have been true. Rather, Taylor's study reveals a much simpler and very different look at the prophets of the Christian faith. But surprisingly, the Bible itself provides several descriptors to tell us what Jesus looked like. Still, a tidbit of information tells us that the prophet was not that different from all the other people who lived in the 1st century. For example, in the Gospel, according to Matthew, Jesus is so harmonious that Judas Iscariot has to point out him among his other disciples. This highlights how similar they must be. However, none of the Bibles described how Jesus appeared during his lifetime. Instead, artwork featuring his form has come to embody the number of people who see him now. However, the early images depicting Jesus frankly did not give much importance to Jesus. Rather, 3rd century artists sought to depict symbolic representations of their religious leaders. So, for example, paintings and sculptures depict Jesus not as a prophet, but as a shepherd, more specifically the Good Shepherd. In one such depiction, a young man holds a lamb, and a gentle farmer appears to be a leader of the Christian faith. In reality, such an image emerged from a far-flung place, the Roman catacombs, where the most zealots of Jesus lived. In any case, it would be another century before artists settled on a universal way to represent Jesus in their works. That is why many people today do not imagine Christian leaders as gentle shepherds without beards. Instead, ordinary people seem to imagine Jesus the way artists painted and depicted him in the Byzantine era. Instead, ordinary people seem to imagine Jesus the way artists painted pictures of Jesus during the Byzantine Empire. But as we discovered, the artists who were painting between the 4th and 6th centuries could not rely on the Bible for depiction. And perhaps because the Bible provided few clues about what religious leaders looked like, painters clearly drew their inspiration from elsewhere. Specifically, the artisans seemed to be looking to artwork and motifs from the past to illustrate new versions of Jesus. In fact, the artists apparently looked back to painting from works created 8 centuries before their time. And since Jesus wasn't supposed to live that early, the artwork used as inspiration depicted a different group of gods. In other words, Byzantine artists used Greek and Roman gods to inspire their representations of Jesus. For example, artists imitated Phidias' larger-than-life statue of Zeus at Olympia, located in the temple of the Greek god's namesake. Sculptures created in the 4th century BC gave Zeus floppy hair and a beard. And as we know, Byzantine artists later used the same style when depicting Jesus. It also makes sense that Byzantine artists would use such symbolic features as outlines to depict their gods. As it turns out, others in this field have previously taken inspiration from Olympian Zeus as well. Roman Emperor Augustus had hired sculptors to carve versions of statues with his face instead of the Greek god. Still, the statue of Augustus foreshadowed Zeus's long hair and beard, as the Roman emperor did not possess those traits. Even Byzantine artists had no model to draw from, so when they started Jesus in the form of Zeus, they included all the appearances of God. Then they obviously added more and more elements to make Christian prophets seem as omnipotent as mythical figures. For example, artists in the Byzantine Empire began to depict Jesus as if he were sitting on a throne. And in a 2019 paper for the American Institute of Oriental Studies, Professor Joan Taylor of King's College London writes about this important image. She said having Jesus appear in such a seat represents his authority over the earth and his coming role as judge. Taylor, who specializes in the origins of Christianity and Second Temple Judaism, explains how artists used the Olympian Zeus, a seated statue of the supreme god of ancient Greek mythology, created for the Temple of Olympia, to make their own. It also explains how they were tweaked to fit the mold. She writes that Zeus's hand was replaced in a blessing gesture, with Jesus holding a Bible in his hand instead of a spear. Some artists also began adding a halo above Christ's head. And Jesus's subtle appearance, long-sleeved robe, halo, and flowing hair was solidified in the 4th century as more and more artists followed suit. But each detail had a very specific meaning, according to Taylor. The professor explained, the point is not to present Jesus as a 1st century Jew, but to point out theologically that Jesus is the Christ or King and Divine Son. Additionally, according to Thomas Matthews in his 1993 book The Clash of God, depicting Jesus with long hair helped make him stand out. And ancient works of art gave the creators of the Byzantine Empire the figurative tools they needed to put a long lock on such powerful statements. Matthews explained, in Greek and Roman art, it was a symbol of holiness with loose long hair. Matthews went on to say in letting down his hair, Christ took on a divine aura that set him apart from the disciples and onlookers who represented him. Thanks to Byzantine art, it is clear that long-haired Jesus this intention clearly worked as well, as it became a model for depicting the prophets of the United States. Elsewhere, however, a number of potential ruins apparently established Jesus as a follower. One of the most commonly touted pieces of evidence is the Shroud of Turin. Linen came to public attention in 1354 and, according to some, has strangely familiar traces. So the story goes that after Jesus' crucifixion, the authorities wrapped him in the Shroud of Turin. Therefore, on a piece of cloth there is a stamp of the face of the prophet, very visible to his most ardent followers. However, the Vatican considers the shroud an icon rather than a relic. In 2019, Richard Cargill, a religious studies professor at the University of Iowa, gave History.com an original explanation of the shroud. He said, "The Shroud of Turin has been debunked as a medieval forgery a couple of times since Jesus himself. It's part of a larger phenomenon to harness the power of. Even experts can recall the name of Jesus not only in Byzantine art and medieval relics." Taylor, for one, wrote a book on the subject in 2018 called What Did Jesus Look Like? And the professor appears to rely on artifacts such as ancient ruins, historical documents, and Egyptian funerary art to paint her own picture of the leader of the Christian faith. Taylor later told the American Institute of Oriental Studies that Jesus's wardrobe would be very different from the artistic representation of him wearing a long-sleeved robe and cloak. She said, unlike John the Baptist, Jesus wore ordinary clothes. John's clothes were different enough that he likes to be referred to like Elijah. So Taylor argues that Jesus wore what anyone else in the 1st century BC would have worn. To understand the fashion of the time, Taylor pored over artwork featuring ancient Egyptian mummies. The professor believed that what the mummy wore in the portrait was representative of the entire region, including Judea, the birthplace of Jesus. Then Taylor noticed that the mummy was dressed quite differently from how Jesus appears in the most popular images. In fact, the professor found that men at the time of the prophet would have worn simple knee-length tunics. It appears that the shot style allowed them to move as fast as they needed, and long clothing would have restricted them. Of course, but some people of Jesus' time wore robes similar to those in his popular works of art. But these people came from the elite class of the time to which Jesus did not belong. So, by that estimate, Jesus would have worn a tunic most days. Taylor believes that the tunic also had some colored bands extending from the shoulders to the hem of the garment. Taylor believes that the main tunic fabric was probably not white either. It is argued that in Jesus' time, someone had to bleach the material to make it the same shade as the robes seen in those famous paintings. Instead, Taylor argues that he probably would have worn undyed wool, and, in a sense, the Bible supports this. In fact, the book says that when Jesus becomes an angel, his clothes change to a brilliant white color. However, according to Taylor, One thing the artists likely depicted accurately is that Jesus probably wore a cloak over his tunic. Not only that, but there was probably some color in the cloak as well. Although the art depicts Christ primarily on blue-colored fabric, Taylor believes it could have been red, green, or even purple. The Bible's account of Jesus's crucifixion also supports many of Taylor's claims. That is, the poem states that he wore a tunic, suggesting that he probably wore two separate cloaks. One of the mantles was almost certainly a cream-colored shoulder gown. This is an accessory that must be worn in the lead-up to his execution. Taylor told the American Institute of Oriental Studies that there seems to be no reason to doubt that Jesus wore a cloak. Signs of this were seen not only in the crucifixion scene, but also on other occasions. In the Gospel of John, Jesus takes off his cloak when he washes the feet of his disciples. Taylor then analyzed Jesus's footwear. Of course, archaeologists have discovered the remains of shoes made in the same era that Jesus lived. So, in the 1st century, shoemakers would sew pieces of leather together to make strappy sandals. So the professor surmised that Jesus probably also wore these types of open-toed shoes. But perhaps more importantly, Taylor studied what Jesus looked like physically. Once again, experts scrutinized portraits of mummies from the same era. The people who appeared there were descendants of Greeks and Egyptians. However, at that time there were a significant number of Jews living in Egypt, and the ethnic groups began to intermingle and become vague. So Taylor argued in her article on the website of the American Institute of Oriental Studies that realistic portraits of mummies are closest to photographs of people from Jesus's own time and place. To imagine the face of the prophet of Judah, you need to imagine someone who actually resembles these photos. Taylor found the later work she described as closest to what Jesus looked like. The piece Taylor found is located within Dura Europos, synonymous with the ancient city to which it once belonged. The inscription dates to 244 AD, making it one of the oldest and best preserved synagogues in the world. Taylor added that there is a piece of art inside that helps paint a clearer picture of Jesus's face. Interestingly, this 3rd century artwork is not supposed to be Jesus. In fact, it is the portrait of Moses that bothers Dura Europos. Still, Taylor explained, the depiction of Moses on the wall of the chapel is probably the most fitting. She added that it all has to do with the roles that both Moses and Jesus played throughout their lives. Taylor says the artwork of Moses in the chapel could suggest what Jesus looked like because it shows how the Jewish sage was imagined in the Greco-Roman world. As written. In the image, Moses is wearing an undyed tunic. This is exactly what Taylor said Jesus wore. Additionally, Moses has shoulder garments exactly what Jesus is said to have worn before his crucifixion. It is also interesting to note that Moses does not have the same flowing locks, hair untangled, that Jesus has in Byzantine art. According to Taylor, that's probably because Christian prophets didn't have hair that long. The experts said that men who lived during his time rarely had long hair. They were considered either pious or girls. However, according to the 3rd century paintings of Taylor and Moses, Byzantine artists got one detail right. Yes, the professor claimed that Jesus probably grew a beard. She wrote on the American Institute of Oriental Studies website. I think he would have had it just because, as a kind of wandering sage, he didn't go to the barber shop. However, the beard had nothing to do with Jesus's Jewish heritage. Taylor explains. This was also the general appearance of the philosopher. He did not have a beard simply because he was Jewish. A beard was not a characteristic of ancient Jews. However, by the 5th or 6th century, beards became known to Jewish men. And perhaps that's where her connection to Jesus, beards and Judaism came from, she said. All this information makes it clear why Taylor saw the picture of Moses in Dura Europos as the most accurate interpretation of the Son of God. And in her 2018 book, What Did Jesus Look Like? She got even more specific, saying the prophet had tan skin, brown eyes, and dark brown hair. It is explained that. Also, Taylor said in her book that Jesus likely measured at about 5 feet, 5 inches tall. This was the average height for a man of his time. Computer modeling by medical artist Richard Neve also backed up her statement. Indeed, he found that men of Jesus's time typically had short stature, curly hair, brown eyes, and tan skin. So while the image of Jesus we have is certainly artistically derived, it's entirely possible that he looked very different from what we've been conditioned to see. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.